I would like to welcome everyone on behalf of the Group of Social Engagement Studies to this conference. Our first two speakers today are Wolfgang Merkel and Lisa Herzog. So we'll have two keynote lectures, 90 minutes, which includes the discussion. Our first speaker today is Wolfgang Merkel, who, as Peter already said, is our old friend. He was also one of our keynote speakers at the conference Thinking Beyond Capitalism last June. Wolfgang Merkel is a world-renowned political scientist and theorist of democracy. He is the director of the Democracy and Democratization Research Program at the Social Science Research Center Berlin, professor of political science at the Humboldt University Berlin, and a member of the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Sciences and Humanities. He is also a non-party member of the Basic Values Commission of the Executive Committee of the German Social Democratic Party, SPD. Professor Merkel studied political science and history at Heidelberg University. In 1985, he obtained PhD in political science at Heidelberg with a thesis on the role and the transformations of the Italian Socialist Party in Italian politics. After obtaining his habilitation in 1992, Professor Merkel started lecturing at the University of Mainz in 1993-94, where he became full professor of political science in October 1994. Between 1997 and 1998, he was the director of the Political Science Institute at the University of Mainz, and in 1996, Professor Merkel got the first prize of the Fritz Thyssen Foundation for Papers in the Social Sciences for his paper, Restrictions and Chances of Democratic Consolidation in the Central and East European Post-Communist Societies in a Comparative Perspective. Since 2004, Professor Merkel is the director of the division within the Wissenschaftszentrum Berlin für Sozialforschung called Democracy, Structures, Performance and Challenges, and professor of political science at the Institute of Social Sciences of the Humboldt University in Berlin. Wolfgang Merkel's primary area of research is comparative political science, in particular the theories of democratization and transformation. Together with Hans-Jürgen Puhle and Aurel Cossin, he introduced into political science the concept of defective democracy and has further elaborated since. Professor Merkel's publications include Demokratie und Krise 2015, The Future of Representative Democracy 2011 with Sonia Alonso and John Keane, and The Capacity to Reform 2008, which has been translated into German, Chinese, and Vietnamese. He authored more than 200 journal articles on subjects of democracy and democratization, 21st century dictatorships, political parties, comparative public policy, the future of social democracy, welfare states, and social justice. And today, Professor Merkel will give a lecture entitled Social Justice and the Three Worlds of Capitalism. Please, Professor Merkel.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, good morning to everybody. I was introduced now 2 times as an old friend, and I'm now in an age where you are suspicious if this adjective old comes up. But listening to the introduction now, I understand why I'm an old friend starting in the mid-1980s, talking about all these things I have done through the 1990s up to now. So I have my first lecture of this conference already. And then I was hesitating a bit to accept this honor to present the first academic speech here at this conference. And the reason is simple. I'm not one of these grand philosophers, and I will certainly not break new theoretical grounds on philosophies of justice. So I was desperately looking what could be my role here. And since I'm a humble political scientist, I decided I should look through the theories and should think about whether we can use these theories for empirical research. And this is what I want to present here. I will rush certainly in an under-complex way through theories of justice, and then I will look for principles which would fit into the sphere of the 21st century, and would also want to look whether these principles can be transformed in indicators. So indicators which allows us to measure levels of social inequality. And this is what I'm trying to do here in the next 30 minutes. As you all know, justice, distributive justice or social justice are one of the most contested concepts in philosophy and social science. Since Plato's Politeia or Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, it has been asked, answered, and contested, what does social justice actually mean? Which are the principles? And how can these principles be justified? I neither have the knowledge nor the time here to go from Plato to Thomas von Aquinas or Hobbes, Kant, John Stuart Mill. I rather will immediately jumpstart into the last quarter of the 20th century, when political philosophy faced a kind of rebirth of its vitality. And certainly one book, one theory was of eminent importance, and this was John Rawls' theory of justice of 1971. And then we could acknowledge and we could see evolving a tremendously rich debate and controversial debate what social justice can mean, what is the relation between state and market, between individual and community, and not at least the eternal question, freedom and equality. I will start my presentation with 3 questions which should guide me and hopefully you as well through my talk. These are the 3 questions. The first is the normative question. Which ideas do we have for social justice which fit into the 21st century? And then what I have already announced, this operational question, could we find dimensions and indicators to measure the quality of social justice in whole societies? And then I give you some empirical results on new data we have collected at my research department in Berlin. As I have already outlined, and you know maybe better than I do, there is a tremendous rich amount of theories. And if you have such a complexity and variety of different theories, it may be helpful to bring some order into this wide-ranging kingdom of theories. And I did it in the following simplified way. I constructed 2 axes, and the one axis runs from the individual to the community, the horizontal axis. And here I'm simply asking, does the theory start from the axiomatic point of an individual or from the community? And the second, the vertical axis, asks, is there an intention for redistribution beyond the market? And if you have, and you cross these 2 axes, you get 4 quadrants. And you see in the left-right corner those theories which start from the individual as the axiomatic point of reflecting social justice, and which are certainly enemies of any substantial redistribution. Then you get what I'm calling here, I'm not sure if everybody will subscribe to it, I call it libertarian justice. And then you find people like Friedrich August von Hayek, the economist, and another economist who sometimes was writing also philosophical matters, Milton Friedman, and you have in Harvard one of the counter players of John Rawls, Robert Nozick, with his Anarchy, State, and Utopia. So this is the left upper corner, and I would put as the clear as one alternative, at least, to the libertarian justice, the communitarian justice. This was the kind of philosophy which emerged at the beginning of the 1980s as a response to the liberal reflection on theory coming from John Rawls. And there is a wide range of different theories, from rather conservative thinkers like McIntyre, again, Aristotle reifying virtue as the core of a good community, and Michael Walzer, who is much closer to Rawls himself, but he is considered as one of the main writers of on social justice in the communitarian camp. And here the starting point is the community, and then it's not that clear, at least to me. This is an open matter of debate. I did not find in the writing many hints of clear and strong, continuous, institutionalized redistribution. Therefore, I place them in the upper right corner. And then probably the most influential thinkers on social justice in the last quarter of the 20th century, Ronald Dworkin, John Rawls, and more recently even Amartya Sen. I will come back to them, and probably those are the, not probably, those are the theoretician I try to anchor my concept of social justice. And then I was desperately looking for theorists, for globally accepted theorists on social justice who start from the community and who are very much in favor of redistribution. And I did not find one. It is strange because we would immediately associate, if you think from the community, from the point of view of a community, you should, so to say, logically arrive at an area of pro-redistribution. But maybe here are more specialists and they can teach me that there are some. I did not find them. I will give you again, and this is the last time that I'm apologizing for it. It is certainly under-complex to have 2 minutes to introduce each of these philosophies, so forgive me, this is a restriction of time and maybe also of my knowledge. Libertarian justice, there is a clear starting point. Individual autonomy is the reference, and it has to be protected. It has to be each action from third parties, and especially from the state, has to be clearly restricted not to infringe into the individual autonomy. And if there are exceptions, then there is a coercion to justify these exceptions, and indeed you don't find very many of them if you go, for example, through the writing of Friedrich August von Hayek. Clear redistribution enemy, no redistribution beyond the market. The market is the most rational system, and it's not only the most efficient system of distributing goods and services, it is also the sphere where morale is evolving. It is simply evolving. It's nothing planned, nothing constructed, not by rationality, nor by political majorities. And Hayek and others claim this evolutionary morale of the market is superior to any other. So in constructing in describing such an evolutionary morale and the working inside it, then they come up what most of the theories of justice accept, at least to some extent, the principle of meritocracy. So you get really what you put in under, and this is something we discuss certainly during these 2 or 3 days, starting from different preconditions. The question is always, does this principle of meritocracy works, or are they different opportunities and life chances to take or to benefit from such a principle? So, to sum it up, it is legal equality. This is a de jure equality plus a maximal contractual liberty. And for those who cannot support themselves, even Hayek accepts there should be a minimal social security. And if you look through the writing of Friedman, and the Friedman Jr. and Hayek, and you try to find out what kind of volume should the welfare state, for example, have, and they are talking about 10% of the GDP or even less. So it's a classical concept of a marginal welfare state you may find to some extent in the United States of America. Communitarian justice. As I have already outlined, the starting point is the community. This is a reference. Social justice should be something which should be exercised, exerted, and protected in the community. They don't speak about society. They use the term community. And if you use the term of community, you immediately define it. You have to define it by cohesiveness. So it has to be cohesive. Just in parentheses, this is not only an academic exercise. If you look what is happening now in Europe, now the political scientist obviously comes up. If you look what is happening in Europe at this time, the migration waves and how the different countries deal with them, you find, according to my observation, two sorts of communitarianism. Those who are in favor of closing the borders. I would anyway say the cardinal difference between cosmopolitans and communitarians is whether they want to close the borders for goods, services, culture, people, or you open these borders. And you can call the cosmopolitans, who are clearly the winner of globalization, you can call these are the frequent flyers. The frequent flyers who have the cultural baggage and the cultural potential to adapt, and they are the winners. And communitarians, if I translate it to the situation now, are to some extent found at the lower strata of our societies. And the more dirty, nasty, and not so sympathetic version of these communitarians are right-wing populists. They close. They want to have cohesive communities. They mix it certainly with xenophobic tendencies. Probably this is also a logical outcome. So the more noble version of community is not only these US American, in Princeton mostly based political philosophers, and I can understand if you live in Princeton, this wonderful, nice, cozy middle strata community, then you can be a community. You can deliberate. You can have town hall meetings, and you govern yourself. This is civil society. But if you go only 100 miles eastward to New York, to the Bronx, this certainly will not work. And you have the noble forms, what I would call the more noble forms of these cohesive communities you find in Scandinavian social democracy. They call it Volkshemmet. This is something where they develop solidarity. They develop mutual trust between the members of the community. Social capital, the core of social capital is mutual trust. And this is an alarming sign that social trust is the higher, the more social cohesiveness, and forgive me this word, homogeneity exists. Homogeneity, I don't mean only in ethnic terms, but unfortunately only in ethnic religious terms, but certainly also in class terms. This is not a normative observation, of course not. This is an empirical observation, and certainly there is no way back in times of globalization to these kind of romantic, anachronistic, cohesive communities. But we cannot give up it as a guiding idea. So civil society trumps the state. It's quite important that T.H. Marshall, the great writer on welfare states in the midst of the 20th century, he talks about social citizenships guaranteed by the state. This is not the idea of the communitarians. There should be a basic level of security, but then the communities, the local communities, decided through direct participation of the members of the community. Again, something quite sympathetic, but to some extent also very nostalgic and romantic. So I see some problems if you do not guarantee by the state, by a strong tax state, by a strong welfare state, this kind of social security, this kind of social equality you need in order to create equal opportunities and, in the words of Amartya Sen, equal life chances. This is something you know, and I will be very, very brief. Of course, priority is also given to the individual. According to my reading, you can take these philosophies, despite the fact they are mostly labeled as liberal, you can take these philosophies and come to quite substantial redistribution beyond the market. And if you take it seriously, what Rawls is writing about also, his theory is directed against the lottery of nature. You are not responsible that you are born in rich or in broken families. You are not responsible whether you are intelligent or not, beautiful, attractive or not. And we all know this plays an important role when it comes up to your career and when it comes up to your life chances. It's clear, two principles of justice. The one is a completely accepted one. This, in democracies at least, this is equal distribution of political rights. No discussions about that. What has been discussed again and again is a second principle of justice, the principle of difference. The second part of this principle says inequality can be justified in so far as it benefits most the least advantaged of a society. This is the second part of this second principle. And if you take this principle serious, then probably the Swedish welfare state is even not good enough for bringing this about. But here there is a vast literature and discussion talking about the correct interpretation. I will come back to this point as well. Very brief, what I found fascinating in the writing of Amartya Sen, also this kind of amphibian human being an economist, reasoning completely in a rational choice way, but when he writes about philosophy, so to say, the other part of his soul or his intellectual character, he writes about capabilities. To cut a more complex story short, it means the state and society has to guarantee that each individual can develop its own capabilities, the capabilities which help them to develop bold life plans and give them the instruments, the possibilities to realize these life plans. So capabilities and individual empowerment is what I take out of this rather complex and complicated writings. Forget what I have written here, hierarchy, this is wrong, and the last sentence is also wrong. It's not a hierarchy of preferences, and I would not run in each house, which you certainly find if you want to defend, let's say, that inclusion into the labor markets ranges higher than gender equality. That's not what I mean. This is something wrong. I did not correct it last night. I used this transparency for different reasons, and I did not have gender equality in it. So just believe me, there is not a closet chauvinist here talking from the podium. Before I start into the exercise finding these indicators for measuring the quality of social justice in a society, I tested a different concept, a concept of equality and freedom. If you look at Hayek's writing, this is clear. Too much equality disturbs, destroys freedom. This is an ongoing subtext in the writing of Hayek. But you find it already when you are reading Tocqueville. In his Democracy in America, he clearly spells out that the future will be equal societies, but too much equality may challenge, may even destroy freedom. And I was looking where I had data for 80 countries, most developed countries, and we correlated first only political equality and freedom rights, and there is almost a perfect correlation, meaning the more political equality you find, the more freedom rights, and not only de jure but de facto. These are the indicators we were using, clear clear positive correlation, mutual strengthening. This is also something relevant for political action, I guess. And then I said, okay, political equality, it's quite close to freedom rights. Let's look at economic equality. And you still have a quite significant correlation between the two. So the more socio-economic equality you find, the more freedom rights. So this goes clearly against Tocqueville and even more against libertarian economists or philosophers who I was presenting before. These are academic exercises. I don't want to bore you. What I did here, I derived two main principles of the writing of this socio-liberal left bottom corner. You remember Rawls and Sen, and I tried to transform these principles in 7 dimensions. I was looking, these dimensions make up the fabric of social justice, preventing poverty, enhancing education, equal education, inclusion into the labor market, establishing a consistent, protective and activating welfare state, equality or not too high inequality of income, justice of generation, on own topics certainly, and gender. Then I was looking to indicators, and certainly this is an ongoing work, and they can be found more indicators, especially if it comes to gender. However, it's extremely difficult to find data you really can compare. For example, for gender, you can certainly look inclusion into the labor market, wage gap to men, top positions in politics, and especially in the economic world. But I did not find so far data I can use to compare. But I do think this is still a reasonable tableau of indicators you can use. I was looking to not only for 5 worlds of welfare capitalism. The first one is these nice, cozy states in the north, Scandinavia, then Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, continental Europe, and the 5th one would be the Anglo-Saxon states from United Kingdom through the United States, New Zealand, and so forth. Then I was puzzled. We all know the discussion of Piketty, and I believe Piketty is to a large extent right, and he has quite impressive analytical work done to convince his readers. But what you see here from 1990 up to 2012 are the graphs of these 5 worlds. I have outlined Anglo-Saxon until Eastern Europe. What you see basically is a slow of most of them, is a slow increase of social justice. Don't ask me now how we statistically transformed these indicators through set transformation. It's even more boring. The blue line is what we expect. This is Scandinavia, and despite the fact that Sweden lost some of its uniqueness, there's still a slow increase the way I measure social justice in the Scandinavian world. The same is true for continental Europe. This is not a clear development where all of these indicators move in the same direction. For example, the Gini, the inequality index, clearly increased, so we have clearly a higher inequality. With each indicator, we can measure it. But let's have a look to this green line. This is the region we are in, and the green line is the only one, I would say, where you don't have an increase. You don't have an increase on on social justice, and there is always a certain point where you have a downward trend, which is especially marked in Southern Europe. This is the time of the financial crisis. So if I am right with my empirical exercises, inequality may increase within the OECD world. The more complex index of social justice does not confirm it in the same way. This is what I tell my younger colleagues in my department: never ever show such a transparency. And this is only to show you that I worked at the end for this conference, and we constructed all this data. You have a ranking, and since we are in Belgrade, Serbia is not at the very end of these 30-something countries or 30 countries. There is Spain. Japan has very much to do also with the indebtedness of the state, and Greece. I think I come very fast to the end. This is again Eastern Europe, what I have shown to you. Unfortunately, here it's data, and especially for Serbia, were not easy. There are too many missings. So the high fluctuation is to some extent produced by missing data. But you see again this average. There is a slow decline, and there is an increase of not only of inequality, but there seems to be also an increase of social injustice. And why Eastern Europe performs pretty well is in terms of sustainability or future of the justice in the future. It's the area where you have the lowest indebtedness of the state. And since I'm by far, Sandhya, by far the lowest if you compare it, and it has very much to do, of course, with the past, the legacy. And of course, these were not wonderful democracies, as we all know. These were dictatorships. But in terms of equality, in terms of social justice, and the relation between men and women, again, is a different one compared to Greece or to Portugal. We have to say these are legacies of the past which still have a positive influence. I have to say it, if it comes to my proper field of research, democracy, you have negative legacies, but obviously not in social justice. Last slide, written in the morning, just before I had to leave the hotel. I don't want to contradict Piketty. Piketty is right with this tremendous increase of inequality, but a specific form of inequality especially at the top. It is not only the 10%, this is something wrong the sociologists never understand. 10%, you have many people among this group completely powerless and not very high income anyway. Even German professors would rank among them. It is about the 0.01% of the population where the income tremendously exploded in times of globalization and digitalization. And this is a true challenge to democracy, and probably in the United States, the most traumatic one we face at the present. Hayek and Tocqueville, I think, are wrong that socioeconomic equality challenges and damages freedom. We found exactly the opposite link between the both. The more democracy you have, the more social justice, and the other way around. The question of causality is not solved here. This is still only correlation. Of course, it depends very much what kind of social justice concept you have. and you have to justify it. And if I would have presented this at the business school in Harvard or somewhere, they would immediately challenge this strange understanding of social justice. And I don't think it's that easy, and certainly we cannot come to a consensus. There are different concepts. We have to fight, we have to debate, we have to deliberate which of them can be justified in a manner that it is acceptable not only to a few elites but to broader segments of the population. As I have said, Eastern Europe is different. There's a good and a bad message. I expected when I started, Eastern Europe will be at the end of this social justice ranking. It did not come up. We recalculated one time these data, and it did not change, but the not so positive message is it's the only one where you don't find a slight increase. On the opposite, there is a slight decrease. So as a classical social scientist, I end with a bad message. This is what we learned in school. We are in university, not very constructive, but I hope I delivered some constructive arguments during my talk. Thank you very much for your patience listening to me.